The courtroom was silent, so silent you could hear the boy's small, shaky breath echo off the cold marble walls. He couldn't have been more than 12, standing barely tall enough to see over the wooden table. But when the judge asked who would be speaking for his mother, the boy lifted his chin and said something that froze everyone in place. "I'm my mom's lawyer." Gasps filled the room. No one knew what to expect from the child who dared to challenge a system that had already written his family off. But what happened next would leave the entire courtroom speechless. Before that unforgettable day in court, Jamal's life had already been shaped by battles he never asked for. Growing up in a quiet southern town, he watched his mother, Denise, work 2 jobs, cleaning offices by day and waiting tables by night, just to keep their small apartment. She was strong, proud, and determined to protect her son from the ugliness she had faced since childhood. But racism had a way of finding them, creeping into every opportunity she tried to reach for. When Denise was wrongly accused of stealing from her employer, it wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a reflection of the quiet prejudice that ran through the town's veins. There were no witnesses, no proof, just assumptions whispered in polished offices by people who thought she looked the type. Overnight, Denise went from a trusted worker to a criminal suspect. With no money for an attorney, she faced losing everything: her job, her home, and, worst of all, her dignity. Jamal saw the fear she tried to hide behind tired smiles, and something inside him shifted. Every night after school, he sat at the kitchen table, reading old law books from the library, teaching himself the words he barely understood. He wasn't just reading about justice, he was preparing to fight for it. By the time the court date arrived, Jamal wasn't just a scared boy anymore. He was a son fueled by love, anger, and an unshakable belief that truth didn't need a title to be heard. The courthouse smelled of paper and polished wood, but to Jamal, it smelled like fear. His mother's hands trembled as she stood beside him, her eyes darting toward the rows of faces watching, most of them pale, some curious, a few quietly judging. The prosecutor smirked when he saw the boy holding a folder instead of a lawyer's briefcase. To them, this was a spectacle, a child's misplaced courage. But Jamal didn't care how small he looked. He only cared about proving his mother's innocence. As the hearing began, the accusations poured out, cold, rehearsed words wrapped in false confidence. Denise's employer claimed she had taken company property, though no evidence existed. It was all built on tone, on the unspoken assumption that a struggling black woman was guilty by default. The judge's eyes flickered between the papers and Jamal, unsure what to make of this situation. A boy representing his mother wasn't just unusual, it was unheard of. When Jamal finally spoke, his voice wavered at first, but the words were sharp. He recited details from the company's policy handbook, quoted passages about employee rights, and pointed out inconsistencies in the employer's timeline. Every fact he presented was something he'd spent sleepless nights memorizing from borrowed books and public records. The courtroom began to shift. Murmurs filled the air, not mocking this time but surprised. Still, the prosecutor wasn't ready to be embarrassed by a child. He pressed harder, using his authority like a weapon. He questioned Jamal's credibility, scoffed at his lack of experience, and tried to corner him into silence. But every insult only fueled Jamal's determination. He looked straight at the man and calmly exposed the missing pieces in the case: the locked storage room only supervisors could access, the absence of fingerprints, and the conveniently missing surveillance footage. The audience leaned forward. Even the judge's posture changed. What began as a simple hearing was turning into a revelation of how power hides behind prejudice. Jamal wasn't just defending his mother. He was challenging an entire system that assumed he'd never have the strength or intellect to stand there at all. And when he ended his argument with a trembling voice but steady eyes, the silence that followed wasn't disbelief. It was respect, slowly, reluctantly being born in a place that had long forgotten what fairness truly meant. Tit. The judge leaned back, expression unreadable, as the courtroom air grew thick with tension. The prosecutor, red-faced and frustrated, shuffled his papers, realizing the cracks in his case were widening with every word the boy had spoken. But before anyone could breathe, Jamal stepped forward once more, holding up a single page, a document he had found hidden within the company's publicly available financial filings. It was a statement showing that items identical to what Denise had been accused of stealing had already been written off as lost inventory weeks before the alleged theft. It was irrefutable proof that the accusation was a cover-up, a convenient way to shift blame from within the company onto the one person they thought couldn't fight back. The courtroom erupted into murmurs. The prosecutor demanded to know how the boy had even found such a record. Jamal's voice, though quiet, carried the weight of every sleepless night and every moment he'd watched his mother suffer in silence. "Because I had to," he said simply. "No one else would." The judge's gavel struck once, echoing like thunder. Order was restored, but the tone had shifted entirely. The employer, once smug and certain, sat pale and sweating, unable to meet anyone's gaze. The judge called for a recess to review the document, but everyone in the room already knew the tide had turned. For the first time, Denise allowed herself to cry, not from fear, but from the overwhelming realization that her son, her little boy, had done what trained professionals hadn't dared to do. He had made them listen. When the judge finally returned, his words were brief but powerful. The case against Denise was dismissed. The accusations, unfounded. And though procedure demanded composure, even he couldn't help but glance at Jamal with something rare in that courtroom: respect. When the gavel fell for the final time, the weight that had pressed on Denise's shoulders for months seemed to lift. Reporters would later write about the boy who became his mother's lawyer, but for Jamal, it was never about headlines. It was about dignity, the right to stand in a place that wasn't built for him and still demand to be heard. As they left the courthouse, the same people who had doubted them now stepped aside in silence, some avoiding their eyes, others looking on with quiet awe. But beneath the triumph lingered a deeper truth. Jamal's victory didn't erase the prejudice that had made his mother a target in the first place. It simply exposed it, raw and undeniable. And maybe that was the point. Change doesn't always roar through laws or speeches. It begins in moments like this, when courage forces the world to stop and look at itself. Somewhere in that small southern town, a system cracked just enough for light to get through. And as Jamal held his mother's hand, he realized that sometimes justice doesn't wear a robe or hold a title. It speaks through the heart of a child who refuses to stay silent. Would you have been brave enough to do what Jamal did?